In just 72 hours, a single order from the White House didn't just blow up a $43 billion deal with Boeing, it opened the door to a new era of global trade no longer centered around Washington. What seemed like a strategic tariff move quickly became the catalyst for a quiet yet determined reconstruction. Where Canada was chosen as the replacement, Europe wrote new rules of the game, and the U.S. was left behind. This is no longer a dispute. This is a methodical separation. One tariff order, one seismic shock. No war, no global financial crisis, just a single number, 35%, was enough to shake the foundations of global trade. A number written in the Oval Office, signed by a president with a confrontational style, and issued as if absolute power still belonged solely to the United States. But what Washington believed was a lever turned out to be the trigger for a systemic exodus, marking the start of an era where there is no going back. August 1st was initially just a calendar note in the offices of global trade chambers. But with the decision to impose a 35% tariff on goods from Canada, 30% on the EU and Mexico, the U.S. president didn't just target shipping containers, he targeted the very structures that defined American economic leadership for nearly a century. In less than 3 days, the effects rippled with the speed of the digital age. A $43 billion aircraft contract canceled, $95 billion in retaliatory tariffs triggered, and over $2 trillion in global trade thrown into turbulence. It wasn't a coincidence. Every reaction had already been filed away, just waiting for the moment Washington shot itself in the foot. What was once called leverage no longer works in a world too accustomed to shocks from across the Atlantic. The difference this time wasn't the tariff number. It was the world's speed of response. No panic, no desperate negotiation, just the beginning of rebuilding from scratch. When President Trump signed the order, he believed nations couldn't live without the U.S. market. But he forgot that those markets, Europe, Canada, Mexico, were no longer alone. They weren't trying to tolerate America anymore. They were removing it from the equation. Right after the tariffs were announced, the Euro Stoxx X 600 index dropped over 2%, not out of fear, but because investors immediately recalibrated America's role in the supply chain. Contracts were paused, shipments rerouted. Policymakers in Brussels, Berlin, and Ottawa got to work, not to negotiate, but to build a replacement trade architecture. And as the White House swung its hammer, the rest of the world quietly constructed new assembly lines, without the U.S. at the center. What's remarkable is that this shift didn't come with smoke or emergency news flashes. There were no tense G20 summits. It happened like an earthquake without sound, but with enough depth to cause structural subsidence. When Airbus rose 3.7% in market value in a single trading session, it wasn't because of a technical breakthrough, it was because investors understood the game had changed. When China's Comac made it onto Ryanair's shortlist, no one had to announce a replacement. Silence said it all. The FAA, once the global standard setter in aviation, was no longer assumed to be the only authority. From a single tariff order, the U.S. had triggered something that no ally dared to do in 70 years. A deliberate decoupling from the American-led system. Not out of hatred, not out of cultural rift, but because instability had become a strategic risk. The world needs a center that is predictable, trustworthy, and capable of building a long-term future. Every time Washington turns its back on an agreement, every time it uses tariffs as punishment, another brick is pulled from the foundation America once built. In the end, what the U.S. administration believed to be its strength, the ability to decide and act unilaterally, turned out to be a fatal weakness in an increasingly multipolar system. Because in today's world, a lever only has value if others are still playing the game with you. And when a single tariff order can collapse a multi-billion-dollar deal, No one wants to bind themselves to an unpredictable partner. One signature, one line, one order. And just like that, a new chapter in global economics quietly begins, without an explosion, without a declaration of war, just with America stepping outside on its own. Europe is no longer retaliating, they're replacing. As the shockwave from the White House's tariff order still echoed, Brussels didn't need to raise its voice. They didn't hold angry press conferences, didn't announce a withdrawal from alliances. They did something simpler, but more effective. They began rewriting systems and left no room for the U.S. in them. Unlike past trade retaliations, typically stopping at tit-for-tat tariff charts, Europe's response this time was constructive, not confrontational. Behind the $95 billion in U.S. goods listed for countermeasures was a terrifying silence. No one was asking what America wanted anymore. European Commission officials didn't go on TV to protest. They went to factories, to boardrooms in Frankfurt, Madrid, and Milan, to build a Europe that no longer needs Washington as its reference point. And they began with a quiet but fatal strike: Boeing. For the past 2 decades, Boeing hasn't just been a symbol of American industrial might. It's represented an era when American technical standards equaled global standards. If the FAA approved an aircraft, the world assumed it was the benchmark. But today, European airlines are recalculating, not because of Boeing's engineering, but because of the political risk coming from Washington. When Ryanair, one of Boeing's largest European clients, publicly included China's COMAC in its evaluation list, it wasn't just an economic equation. It was a silent declaration. American aviation standards are no longer untouchable, and if Ryanair actually selects COMAC, it will be the first time in modern history that a major European airline accepts a certification system not from the US or Europe. Behind that shift lies a wave of questions within aviation agencies. Can we still trust the FAA's stability when a single tweet can collapse an entire supply chain? Boeing isn't alone. Harley-Davidson, the icon of American muscle bikes, also found itself on the symbolic retaliation list. Tariffs aimed directly at large motorcycles, a product deeply tied to the U.S. middle class and political swing states. It wasn't coincidence. Brussels didn't want an impulsive counterstrike. They wanted Washington to feel it right in the heart of its political geography. But more importantly, Europe didn't stop at emotional reaction. They began systematically reducing dependence on the U.S. In 2024, U.S. agricultural exports to the EU fell by over $23 billion, not because of productivity or quality, but because Europe sought alternatives from Latin America, Africa, and their own production. Instead of relying on milk and butter from the Midwest, the EU signed new agreements with Argentina, Brazil, and Norway, not to hit back, but to remove the U.S. from the supply equation. The less dependent, the less vulnerable. That's the strategic principle Europe now follows as a compass for every new contract. They don't need to shout, "We object." They simply stop signing, stop buying, stop trusting. And that silence is more powerful than any criticism. More importantly, Europe is redefining what trade means. To them, trade is no longer just about transactions. It's an ecosystem of values, rules, standards, and long-term commitments. And if America no longer contributes to that ecosystem with stability and cooperation, then America's role will be redefined, not by words, but by structure. Every time Airbus secures a new order, every time a European company turns to a supplier in Canada, China, or India, every time a digital agreement is signed without referencing American standards, another node is tied in the replacement network. Brussels doesn't want to break the transatlantic relationship, but when they realized that trust in America was no longer a reliable foundation, they chose to redesign the system. And that system, with new trade routes, new standards, new supply chains, is operating without needing Washington's approval. Europe is no longer retaliating. They're replacing. And that's what should worry the United States the most. Canada. From buffer zone to anchor point. When Washington closed its doors, the world didn't stand still and wait. And in the tall, often overlooked shadow of a quiet neighbor, a once silent partner is gradually stepping into the spotlight. Canada. No need to break any rules, no need to withdraw from any agreements. Canada simply did one thing: open the door at the right time, in the right place, with the right values the world now longs for: stability, transparency, and long-term commitment. No one expected that a sweeping tariff move by the U.S. would inadvertently turn Canada into the new hub connecting Europe and the Western world. But facts don't lie. While trade barriers went up at the southern border, new trade routes quietly took shape in the north. And leading this transition is CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union, once seen as a reference model, now becoming the primary path replacing the United States. Europe didn't choose Canada out of sentiment. They chose it for structure. CETA doesn't just eliminate nearly all tariffs between the two blocs. It also embeds labor standards, environmental protections, data regulations, and dispute resolution clauses. The very things Washington now sees as burdens. In a world where consistency is becoming the new currency, Canada has become the vault of trust. The numbers are beginning to reflect the shift. Canadian steel exports to Europe rose by 24% in just the first quarter, as EU businesses pulled out of U.S. supply chains. In the clean energy sector, a strategic front for Europe, Canada saw a 41% increase in clean tech exports. Not by chance, but driven by a €1.2 billion hydrogen agreement between Ottawa and Brussels, a step long in the making, waiting only for the right moment to ignite. And that moment came precisely when Washington locked itself into a punitive mindset. When the White House cut funding for climate transition, Canada signed new climate treaties with the EU. When the U.S. turned its back on international labor norms, Canada embedded them into every new trade deal. When the U.S. withdrew from its global digital leadership role, Canada partnered with Europe to establish common standards for smart energy grids and AI governance. The difference doesn't lie in the size of the economy. It lies in the attitude toward the future. While the U.S. defines trade through power, Canada defines it through value alignment. And that has made Canada a long-term partner in a short-term world. Europe wasn't alone in noticing this. Other countries are also redirecting their focus northward. India, Japan, the United Arab Emirates, all are negotiating or signing cooperation frameworks with Ottawa. Not because they want to abandon the U.S., but because they can no longer bet on an economy that no longer promises long-term commitment. Canada doesn't make noise. It doesn't declare it's replacing America. But the data flows, the goods streams, the digital contracts, the new energy standards, they're all shifting north. And that has led international observers to quietly ask, in the 21st century, is the heart of Western trade still in Washington, or has it moved to Ottawa? In a multipolar world taking shape, nations are no longer just seeking markets, they're looking for anchors of trust. And amid the political earthquakes, Canada stands out as a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. It is no longer the one caught between America and the world. It's becoming the bridge between continents, between values and efficiency, between Western tradition and modern cooperation models. The irony is that everything Canada is harvesting today didn't come from a spectacular leap, but from the quiet perseverance of a long-term strategy. And as the world begins to redraw the map of global trade, perhaps the pen is no longer in America's hand, but in the hands of nations like Canada, steady, adaptable, and fully aware that in an uncertain world, it's the trustworthy who lead the way. Rebuilding without America. In past trade crises, the world often responded by calling America back to the negotiating table. But this time, everything is changing. There are no emergency G7 meetings, no transatlantic phone calls, no invitations urging Washington to return to its former role. Instead, something unprecedented is happening. Europe is rebuilding the global trade system without needing the United States. In Brussels, meetings no longer revolve around how to convince the U.S. to adjust tariffs, but focus on building a post-Washington trade framework. Since 2023, the European Union has launched 17 new trade negotiations with economies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Each agreement isn't just about exchanging goods, it's an integrated ecosystem of trade, digital infrastructure, climate, and supply chains. In 2024, the EU signed a $3.4 billion supply chain agreement with India, completely bypassing the US dollar-based payment system. This wasn't a retaliatory strike, but a strategic move to reduce dependence on economies whose policies can shift with every election cycle. In Europe's eyes, trade cannot be anchored to volatile political systems. And if America chooses a unilateral path, then the EU chooses to build structures that can't be dismantled with a single presidential signature. When the US raised tariffs, Europe didn't respond with slogans. They responded with long-term planning and replacement networks. This is shaping a new order, one where dominance doesn't come from GDP or military might, but from the ability to create standards and coordinate global supply chains. That's why CETA, the agreement between the EU and Canada, is no longer just a bilateral deal. It has become a template to be replicated globally. Every new agreement Brussels signs, from Nairobi to Abu Dhabi, follows that model. Zero tariffs, unified labor standards, integrated climate and data goals. While Washington struggles to force countries into short-term commitments, Europe is building durable partnerships grounded in trust and shared rules. That explains why more and more nations are losing interest in renegotiating with the U.S. Because what they need isn't a profitable deal today, but a partner who won't change the rules tomorrow. And in that contest, America is losing points because of its old strength, the power to change everything at will. Rebuilding a system isn't about destroying the old. It's about redefining what's central and who gets to draw the new map. Today, the hand holding the pen is no longer Washington, it's Brussels. And with each contract, each AI standard, each new logistics route, a quiet message is being delivered. The global economic order continues, but it no longer revolves around the United States. When consequences knock on America's economic door, the quiet separation of Europe and the rest of the world is no longer a political reaction. It has become a tangible pain for the U.S. economy itself. What began as symbolic decisions in Washington is now spreading into a real crisis across America's core industries, from aviation and agriculture to manufacturing and high-tech. Boeing was just the first crack, and a symbolic one. But behind it lies a far deeper fracture. American companies that once relied on the EU market as a default part of their business model are now facing a hard truth. Every lost contract is not just lost revenue, but a shift in global supply chain structure, and it's not easily reversed. The U.S. auto industry, once a symbol of industrial power, is facing a dual crisis. On one hand, it is hit by soaring input costs as raw materials are taxed when imported from Europe, Mexico, and Canada. On the other, it's losing competitive advantage in global markets, where rivals, especially from Europe and Asia, enjoy tariff-free benefits under new bilateral trade deals. American automakers now face a harsh choice: raise prices and lose market share, or hold prices and bleed losses. American agriculture is not escaping the spiral either. The states that once formed the political backbone of Washington's hardline tariff policy, like Iowa, Wisconsin, and Texas, are now its direct victims. Exports of milk, butter, beef, and soybeans to Europe have plummeted, not due to poor quality, but because Brussels has proactively shifted to alternative sources from Canada, South America, and even Africa. U.S. farms are not just losing customers. They are also watching their supply chain systems being left behind. The situation is even more serious in the tech and semiconductor sectors. As Europe, India, and Japan build their own semiconductor ecosystems independent of the U.S., American tech firms, from software to hardware, are forced to adapt to a market where they no longer set the technical standards. And in a post-globalization world, where standards equal market share, losing the ability to define those standards means losing the future. No one in Washington dares to say it out loud, but CEOs, investors, and logistics experts all know the U.S. is no longer the default destination for global trade capital. Worse still, it's no longer trusted to be the starting point. In long-term investment plans spanning 10 to 20 years, the priority is no longer market size, but policy predictability. Every surprise tariff, every politically charged trade war, is a red flag in the risk matrix of global planners. And the scariest part isn't the canceled contracts. It's the contracts that are no longer even being mentioned. Negotiation tables without the U.S. supply chain initiatives that don't invite the U.S. new freight, and data routes that no longer pass through U.S. ports, fiber optics, or trade law frameworks. America used to believe it was the pathmaker, but in the emerging system, that role is quietly being reassigned. And what the American economy is experiencing now, declining valuations, business restructuring, shrinking market share, is not a temporary slip, but a sign of a larger transition being reinforced each day. If the United States once wrote the rules of global trade, then today it is learning to live in a world where it no longer holds the pen. When trust becomes a scarce asset. In a world where the flow of goods, capital, and data increasingly depends on policy stability, trust has become the most valuable asset. And ironically, it is the United States, a nation once seen as the stronghold of reliability, of commitments enduring across administrations and party lines, that has now become a risk factor in the eyes of global partners. This didn't happen overnight. It accumulated through cycles of tariffs, sudden executive orders, and repeated withdrawals from international agreements without warning. But the decisive tipping point came when a series of allied nations began signing contracts with each other, without the U.S. at the table. And from there, a new form of global trade began to take shape, based not on size or power, but on what can be predicted, understood, and trusted. While policymakers in Washington still hold on to the belief that alliances can be repaired when needed, global businesses are not waiting for that theory to come true. They are rerouting supply chains, shifting production hubs to Canada, India, Southeast Asia. They are seeking legal and financial systems with lower political risk, because they know a contract broken by distrust cannot be fixed with apologies, but with years of rebuilding, and time is no longer on America's side. Look at aviation. If Ryanair, the largest low-cost airline in Europe, decides to shift from Boeing to Comac, it won't just be a blow to an American corporation's finances. It will be the first major crack in the wall labeled American standards, especially in aviation safety, where the reputation of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, once served as the global compass. And once the FAA is no longer the final word, what remains is not protest, but the fragmentation of international standard-setting authority. The same quiet shift is happening in other sectors: pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, renewable energy, AI, and cross-border data. Wherever there were technical standards, America used to be the rulemaker. But today, Europe is replacing that role with trade-integrated legal frameworks, like the AI Act, the Green Deal, or the cross-border carbon tax mechanism. And nations signing on don't need anyone's permission. They just need a trustworthy partner. From this, a soft alliance model is emerging. No military treaties, no flags, anthems, or summits. Just networks of contracts coded in legal trust, technical standards, and the ability to maintain commitments over time. These linkages don't need the U.S. to start and don't need the U.S. to survive. The cost of losing trust isn't measured in trade deficits, but in eroded strategic relevance. Every nation that once placed the U.S. at the center of its long-term development plans is now spreading risk by diversifying partnerships. And through those quiet moves, the global order is shifting, from unity under one superpower to stratification along networks of trust. In that world, power no longer belongs to the loudest, but to the one who keeps their word the longest. And if the U.S. can't regain that, then the contract's lost, the agreements turned away. Won't be temporary. They'll be the beginning of an era where trust is no longer automatically tied to Washington, when the rulemaker becomes the rule-taker. Some changes are not recorded through official statements, not announced in major press conferences. They don't arrive with applause or greetings, but through persistent silence, as new agreements are signed without the presence of the United States, as shipping routes, data networks, technical standards, energy ecosystems, and global finance systems are redrawn by others. No one declares that America has been removed from the table, but every seat is now taken, and the U.S. name no longer appears on the seating chart. Throughout the 20th century, the United States was not only a military and economic superpower, but also the unofficial rulemaker of the modern world. From the WTO to regional trade agreements, from aviation safety standards to biotechnology law frameworks, America was where nations turned to consult the rules. But today, as major and emerging economies turn to Brussels for new trade frameworks, as India, Japan, Canada, Brazil, and the UAE simultaneously choose to sign EU standard agreements over US ones, one thing is clear. The role of rulemaker has changed hands. America used to believe its power was permanent because every economy needed access to the US market. But it underestimated something more important: the necessity of a system that is predictable, consensual, and capable of coordination. And when America itself broke that principle through unilateral tariffs, withdrawals from trade agreements, and rejection of global standards it once helped create, the world didn't wait for the U.S. to change its mind. The world moved on without America. Today, Brussels doesn't just sign trade deals, they sign blueprints for the global future. These packages integrate AI standards, cross-border data governance, clean energy policies, product origin tracing, and labor rights. They are not scattered commitments. They are synchronized, interoperable networks, forcing participating nations to restructure domestic laws, infrastructure, and long-term strategies. And once integrated, there is no going back to the old system, especially one once controlled by the U.S. Just look at the new trade map: European Union, Canada, Japan, India, ASEAN. Not a military alliance, but a connected network of rules and operating ecosystems, from AI to clean tech, from data to product quality. Meanwhile, the U.S., once the first name on every agreement, is now left to wait and see if it even gets mentioned on the final page. And this is the most alarming consequence of lost trust. Once the world no longer expects the U.S. to lead, every call to return, every promise to adjust becomes meaningless, because nations don't build their futures on temporary pledges. They build on systems that can function without waiting for someone to change course. The irony is that those once taught by America how to write rules are now inviting America to relearn how to cooperate in a new ecosystem. A world where power no longer comes from pressure, but from the ability to keep promises for 10, 20 years. A world where consistency in rules outweighs flexibility in negotiations. And in that world, the United States, though still a superpower, is being shifted from a leadership role to an observer's seat. There is no announcement marking the end of America's rulemaking era, but the new contracts, certification systems, and trade corridors are being written by a different hand. And if the United States doesn't want to be left behind, it can't return just with words. It must come back with structure, with trust, and with a willingness to listen to the rules it no longer gets to write.